Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes, and it's Monday, the 22nd of March, 2021. And it's lovely to be here again on another week of reading. A big hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Sensible Paul, to Philip Hammond, Billabong O'Neill, Dave Ivad, Michael White, Justine Jones, and a special thanks to Jen Colley. I have this very little note that came through my door the other day and over the weekend. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Genevieve for your very nice little donation and your very lovely note, which says, just a little thank you. I'm really enjoying London Belongs to Me. Your reading really brings it to life. It's a great experience. The early spring of your walks and your life tales are interesting. All the best, Genevieve. Thank you so much. That's so kind. I was thrilled when I got that. Also, he's not here yet, but Dudley, at the end of Friday's show, knocked on my door because he only lives around the corner, and he thrust into my hand a lovely card. Actually, I meant to bring that in. That's in my office. And he had a little donation in there, which was very kind of him. We had a nice little conversation, and I can't offer him in yet for a cup of coffee as such, but I think we're going to be able to do that soon, at least in gardens and things. So that would be nice. Bloody rules and regulations and telling us how to live our lives. It's outrageous, really, but there you are. Hello to Audrey Forbes and to Anne H. Very nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming along. It's not quite 4 o'clock. It's coming up to 4 o'clock. Let a few more people just arrive before we start. Hope you had a good weekend. Started off a bit muggy and cloudy here in Worthing, where I am, but it's suddenly gone sunny this afternoon, which has been lovely. Now, I hope you can all hear me. I assume that I'm not just silently. On the Vogue show last Friday, we had an issue where suddenly the sound went off because I updated the computer. And funny enough, I've got another message saying it wants to update it again. I don't want to do that now. I've updated it. Don't want to do it a second time. Nice that you are appreciated so much, says Michael White. Thank you. Yeah, no, it is nice. It is very nice. It's always humbling when people thank you in that way. It is very, very jolly. So thank you very much, everybody. So now, where were we with the book London Belongs to Me? I think we're on chapter 13. Nigel Sadler, hello to you. And loud and clear. Marvellous. Thank you, Anne, which is good. I have to be careful when I rest I'm resting my book on that. You can't see it actually in the shot, but my mixing control desk is just here. And when I rest the book on it, it tends to move the knobs, and sometimes the volume goes up too loud. Turbo Stream says, just had a lovely 20 minutes sitting in the sunshine on my patio listening to the bird song. Oh, lovely. That's very nice. I have to say I've been sitting outside the front of my house listening to the traffic go past, but I was in the sunshine reading, so that was nice. Steve G, good afternoon to you. Sensible Paul, lovely to see you. Thank you for coming along. We're about a minute past. I'll have a glug of water today. So what was the last thing? Oh, yes, we had that very strange incident with Percy Boone, who has stolen a car, and he has done some modifications to it, getting it ready for the client. Dear, oh dear. Handling stolen property. What is going to happen to him? Who knows? Anyway, chapter 13. Mrs. Vizard was attending to her bit of unpleasantness with Connie. She had declined to take the chair, her chair, that Connie had offered her, and in consequence the interview was stilted and formal. Connie perched herself on the corner of the bed and sat down, looking at her old feet in their swan's-down bedroom slippers, and Mrs. Vizard stood over her. "Never had anything happen like this in this house before," she was saying. "Same with me," Connie told her. "Victimised. That's what I was. Victimised." Your private life is of no concern of mine, Mrs. Vizard went on. It's no part of my business to speak about it. I see your point, Connie agreed with her. She was swinging her foot as she was talking, and this time the swansdown bed slipper dangled for a moment and then fell off. Mrs. Vizard waited for her to replace it. It took some time, however, as several rolled-up bits of old newspaper, which Connie used for stuffing up the toes, the shoes were a full size and a half too big for her, and they came tumbling out and had to be gathered up again. But remember, it is my house, and I can't have things going on here, Mrs. Vizard resumed. I'll remember, Connie said contritely. I was caned. I don't deny it. Oh, not caned, canned. Canned? I think it was. I was canned. I don't deny it. While she was remembering how canned she had been, she started to hum. The humming annoyed Mrs. Vizard. I shall have to ask you for your room, she said. Connie started. You mean you want me to hop? She asked. Mrs. Vizard merely nodded. She disliked vulgarity on all occasions, and she wished that Connie could have avoided it now. I mean, I shall have to ask you for your room, she repeated. Connie gave a little laugh. And how do you think you'll get your money if I buzz off? She asked her. There's 3 weeks now, isn't there? She hadn't initially intended to mention it. She hadn't, in fact, thought that there would be any need, as Mrs. Vizard would do so, but now she was playing for time. I'm quite aware of how much is owing, Mrs. Vizard answered, and I'm prepared to forgo it. Connie raised her eyebrows. I always said you were a very generous woman, she told her. Mrs. Vizard sniffed. I don't want to be hard on anyone, she said, but I've got my own interest to look after. Are you sure you won't sit down? Connie asked her. I've got nothing to sit down for, Mrs. Vizard answered. I've said what I've come to say. Have you got anything else in mind? Connie required. It'd be a shame to have this beautiful afternoon standing empty. Sorry. Have you got anyone else? Have you got anyone else? Sorry, I thought she said, have you got anything else? Have you got anyone else in mind? It would be a shame to have this beautiful room standing empty. What I want is to have this room available by Saturday, Mrs. Vizard replied. I'll attend to the rest. Saturday night. First thing Saturday, Mrs. Vizard answered, and I want it left clean and tidy. It looked as though it was really the end this time. All that she could do was admit defeat. But it would be nice to admit it sportingly, with a bit of a flourish, in fact. So she kicked the swan's down slipper off again, right off into the air, into Mrs. Vizard's face. OK, she said. See you on the embankment. As the door shut, she thumbed her nose at Mrs. Vizard's retreating back. She stood there like that for a moment, but it only relieved her feelings temporarily. It didn't really comfort her. She sat down on the bed again. Connie, my old dear, she said, you're for it. Better pack your toothbrush and your tiara. Tomorrow the fresh woods and pastures new. Then, because she couldn't help feeling miserable at the idea of leaving, she began to cry. The tears ran down her cheeks, carrying smudges of eye black with them. But she was past minding. It was no fun at all, starting afresh at her time of life. Mr. Squales had bought a bunch of violets. Alone in his room, and with the door locked, he was playing with them. He was practising concealing them about him, in his armpits, stuffed into the waistband of his trousers, inside his shoe, and withdrawing them in one sweep of the hand. It had been distinctly amateurish at first, but as the morning wore on, he improved. In the end, underneath his collar band, at the back, turned out to in the end, underneath his collar band at the back turned out to be the best place. 3 times in succession he was able to produce them almost spontaneously from there and send them flying across the room with a little flip of his fingers. After the 3rd success, he sat back satisfied. Producing flowers from nowhere was now something else that he could do, and he was determined that his next séance should be a flowery one. The only thing he needed was a fresh bunch of violets. It had been a funny life, his, when you come to think of it. He'd done so many things, so many and so different. Phrenology, for example, reading bumps on people's heads. He'd got the charts and the diagrams in one of his bags somewhere, and the skull, it was a rather good skull, complete with all teeth, a child's, somewhere between 12 and 13. He'd paid £10 for it, and if the phrenological textbooks were correct, in life the child had been in the way of a musical genius with a flair for agriculture. Indeed, it seemed sad that anyone so remarkably gifted should have died so young. Not that the bumps were really anything to go by. He'd run his fingers over scalps that had disapproved everything the experts had written, guardsmen and ex-sergeant majors with strong maternal instincts, and women tired by unsuspected cravings for adventures and the open sea. In those days, he had occupied one of those little kiosks on the West Pier at Brighton. His cloak and broad black hat had once been a familiar sight on the front, and his practice had brought him in a steady £6 or £7 a week from May to September. If it hadn't been for the remaining 7 months of the year, when it brought in next to nothing, he might have been a Brighton front phrenologist still. There had been the short experiment with palmistry. He'd taken a room in Westbourne Grove and done a little discreet advertising. Your hand is your fortune, and let Professor X read the lines of your life. But it wasn't serious, like phrenology. The clients who called on him always wanted to know when they were going to get married and how many children they were going to have. So in the end he told them, promising flat-chested spinsters, tall dark husbands with a small fortune and the knowledge of foreign parts, and telling tired, unhappy men in their late 50s to expect a golden, young-haired bride with small teeth and violet eyes. Just sex, that's all it was. And in the end, it disgusted him. It might all the same have been very paying if only the fat, stupid-looking female who pathetically wanted to know about their love chances hadn't in the end turned out to be I beg your pardon, let me read that again. It might, all the same, have been very paying if only the fat, stupid-looking female who pathetically wanted to know about her love chances hadn't in the end turned out to be a policewoman. After that, they closed him down. So all his acquired knowledge of the human hand had gone the way of his knowledge of the head, and he'd turned to astrology instead. The stars, for a time, had seemed unusually encouraging. For a start, the police couldn't get at them, and though it was illegal to tell a smouldering red-faced girl that there was a clean-shaven young seaman with robust biceps somewhere round the corner of it was illegal. So though it was illegal to tell a smouldering red-faced girl that there was a clean-shaven young seaman with robust biceps somewhere around the corner of the year, it was perfectly in line with the public interest to predict wars, train disasters, shipwrecks, fires in orphanages, and pit explosions. But of course, all that meant a lot of study too. You couldn't just set up in astrology without being familiar with scorpions and bulls and fishes and water carriers and that sort of thing. It just wouldn't stand a chance. Top men, the Sunday paper astrologers, the real modern-day Merlins, were solid with real sound knowledge, all book stuff from the neck up. They could cast a horoscope with their eyes shut. That was why they commanded such enormous salaries. as much as a cabinet minister, some of them. But somehow Mr. Squales had never managed to get himself into the big money class. All down Fleet Street there were men foretelling floods in China and royal divorces, some of them charlatans too, and drawing 2,000 or 3,000 a year for doing so, while the best that he could get was a syndicated half-column in a group of local papers at a couple of guineas weekly. In the end, the sheer hard work and the lack of recognition had led him to abandon astrology as well. He had turned over a lot of other possibilities in his mind. There was psychology, for example, but that was a lot of reading too. And the market was crowded. Or nude photography. A good glossy nude called Eve or Bubbles was always a profitable property. You paid the model a guinea, and you could go on selling prints of her to art students over 18 forever. But he didn't know anything about photography. He hadn't even got a camera. He hadn't got a model. He hadn't even got a guinea. Then massage and chiropody suggested themselves. But there again there were difficulties. The LCC took a close interest. I wonder if that's the London County Council, LCC. The LCC took a close interest and granted licences, or didn't. Mr. Squales thought of setting up quietly without a licence and relying on personal introductions from friends. But he abandoned the idea as too risky. Besides, he had so few friends. So finally, after nearly 2 months of living on his savings, his cigarette case, his watch, his fountain pen, his cufflinks had all gone. He decided to pool all his talents and go in for spiritualism. At the time, it had seemed like the finger of God pointing. Not that it was easy. There was a heart-breaking fortnight while he rehearsed, rolling the back of his eyes and going off into trances and that sort of thing. And that was only the elementary stage. He had to practice voices as well, a variety of them. In fact, it was like learning to be Houdini and Hamlet at the same time. But the real trouble was supply and demand. Even without him, the market seemed overcrowded. Neat, efficient professionals with their prayer books and bits of cheesecloth in little attaché cases went about from séance to séance, picking up their 3 guineas a time, leaving no room for a newcomer. No room, at least, for an ordinary newcomer. As in all other professions, however, there is always room at the top. Always room for someone who could produce spirit faces and ectoplasmic hands and strange scents and sudden drops in temperature. Even a few mysterious flowers arriving suddenly from nowhere in the centre of the table was a good deal better than just plain voices. That was why Mr. Squales was not sparing himself. He was going to practice with the concealed scent spray as well. Tomorrow. That was interesting, wasn't it? You can imagine, actually, that there are people who, even today, sort of practice their spiritualism and their appearing. You don't hear much about ectoplasm and things like that, do you? Good to see. Who else have we got there? Mike Stevens, good afternoon to you. Lee Lawson, which is nice to see, and Dudley Sawyer, man of many talents, or not, as the case may be. And earlier, you probably weren't here at the time, but I did thank you publicly for your very kind, generous gift and your card. Thank you very much, Dudley, for that. So we progress. Let's have a slurp. And Connie? She hadn't been wasting her time. Bless your heart, no. That wasn't Connie's way of doing things. At the moment she was busy in front of the mirror. She already had brushed her hair down very flat, smothering out the little curls that were so difficult to make, and now she was flatly plastering powder on her face. It was dead white powder that gave her a startling corpse-like appearance. Even so, the result was not yet to her liking. She went over to the washstand and came back with a small sponge in her hand. Then, holding her head back, she allowed a few drops to fall on each eyelid. It was magical. Down the wrinkled, chalky face, large tears were running once again, carving their channels through the thick layers of powder. By the time they had dried, Connie was just the way she fancied herself. She might have been in mourning for mankind. "Go on, Connie dear," she told herself. "Give 'em a turn. Get downstairs and smash 'em." She selected 2 depressed-looking handkerchiefs from her bag and left the room, her shoulders heaving. By the time she reached the Jossers' door, she was right inside her part and the sobs were uncontrollable. It was like an encore to her Christmas performance. She felt almost sorry for Mrs. Josser, knowing that the spectacle of tears always broke her good, kind heart. But it was not Mrs. Josser who answered the door when she knocked. It was Mr. Josser. He'd been sitting with his feet up on the fender and a copy of Popular Gardening open on his knees, and he was appalled by this spectre of desolation that suddenly crept in upon him. "Why, whatever's the matter, Connie?" he asked. "I've never seen you this way before." "I've never felt this way before," she told him between sobs. "It's the end. It's my swan song." Mr. Josser drew another chair over to the fire and asked Connie, and Connie sank gratefully into it. But only for a moment. Almost as soon as she had sat down, she began climbing up again. "But I mustn't be stopping," she said miserably. "I told myself I wouldn't. I didn't ought to go about pestering happy folks." "You sit there until you feel better and then tell me about it," Mr. Josser advised gently. There was a pause while Connie was too muffled up with crying to be able to answer. It's no use," she said at last. "All I came down for was a good cry on another woman's shoulder." Mr. Josser got up and stood over by the mantelpiece. "Better get it off your chest, Connie," he said. "We're all friends here." The gentleness of his voice, the fact that he called her his friend, was too much for her. There were fresh paroxysms, interrupted odd phrases. "One of life's unfortunates. Not wicked just because I'm poor. Never harmed a fly." In the end, Mr. Josser had to ask her to start again. I'm being turned out," she said, finally, as soon as she could speak properly. "Turned out because I've been to prison." Mr. Josser shook his head sadly. He was shocked, but not surprised. Mrs. Vizard had certainly taken the whole matter very much to heart. "Not that I bear her any grudge," Connie went on, as though reading Mr. Josser's thoughts. "She's got herself to think of, and if everyone complained about me, I don't see that she had any choice." "Complained about you?" Mr. Josser repeated. "We didn't do any complaining." "No, I'm sure you didn't," Connie answered. "You've both been too kind. It was probably the Boone woman." "No," Mr. Josser said firmly. "She's on your side like the rest of us." Connie pursed up her lips. "Then it must have been Mrs. Vizard's spite," she replied. "She thinks she can treat me this way because she's got a hold on me." "Got a hold on you?" Mr. Josser asked unguardedly. "The arrears," Connie told him. 3 weeks at 7 and 6pence. It's blackmail. And me with only 9pence. "But couldn't you come to some arrangement?" Mr. Josser suggested. "You know, so much a week until it's cleared off." Connie gave a contemptuous little laugh. "Not with her," she said. "Not with Mrs. Shylock. I'm just a pound of flesh." "Did you try?" he asked. "I did," Connie answered. "I grovelled, and she spurned me with her foot." There was a pause, a long, awkward pause, during which Connie glanced once or twice in Mr. Josser's direction. Then she saw that he did not apparently intend to do anything more in the way of consolidation, so she rose weakly and remained standing with one hand on the arm of the chair. "I only really came to say goodbye," she went on. "I didn't want to leave all my friends without seeing them. I knew there wasn't nothing you could do to help me, not with all that money hanging over me." She went limply towards the door and stood there holding out her hand from which the bangle drooped like a houp le quoit. "If you don't ever see me alive again, don't think too badly of little Connie. Tell Mrs. Josser I tried to say goodbye." Mr. Josser came over and shook the hand that was held out to him. It was a small and feeble hand like a child's. The feel of it broke down something inside him. Do you think Mrs. Vizard would let you stop if you could pay her?" he asked. "She'd let Jack the Ripper stop if he could pay," she answered. She broke off. "What's the use of talking about it?" she asked. "I haven't got it, and that's that. Under the stars for me tomorrow if I'm still here." "Just you wait here for a moment," Mr. Josser said. "I'm coming back." As soon as he got outside, he told himself that he was making a fool of himself, but that didn't stop him. He went through into the bedroom, shut the door behind him. In the little pink vase on the mantelpiece was a key. He tipped the vase upside down so the key spilled into his hand, and then he went over and unlocked the top drawer of Mrs. Josser's dressing table. The tin box with cash written on it were two. Inside the tin box with the word cash written on it were 2 £1 notes. They were Mrs. Josser's emergency hoard. She kept them there as a kind of charm against sudden disaster. Mr. Josser took out one of the pound notes. He had a strangely guilty feeling as he did so. "Going round to the post office first thing in the morning and drawing out £1, and I'll replace it," he told himself. Then he felt about in his trouser pocket and extracted £0.50. "Now she's all square, poor old thing," he reflected. Connie was waiting there obediently when he got back. He could tell from her face that she had no notion of the good fortune that was coming to her. She was so completely unaware, indeed, that Mr. Josser found great difficulty giving her the money. He simply thrust the note and the £0.50 into her hand. Luckily, her hand was open, and stepped back. As soon as Connie felt the convincing stiff paper of the pound note against her palm, the fingers closed together like a bird's claw. They were real tears in her eyes this time. "You're a corker," she said. "You're a real good Samaritan, you are. You're just about the kindest thing in trousers I've ever met." Mr. Josser's embarrassment took hold. To Mr. Josser's embarrassment, she took hold of his hand and kissed it. "Don't say anything about this," he asked. "Let it be a private thing between the two of us." "Mum's the word," Connie promised. "Sealed lips, that's me." And that line, I have to say, that is hilarious. "You're about the kindest thing in trousers I've ever met." Oh dear, oh dear. Let's have a look, see what you've been gabbling on. "I saw some colourful flowers appear around the stage in a gig in Brighton once when I was a student. That was because we all took something silly on the train on the way over." Oh, right. "Hello, Linda. There's room for us at the back. Thanks. I'm not sure I have gone down in my estimation." What? Chapter 14 is where we are now, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 14. Are you still enjoying it? Mrs. Vizard glanced at her clock. It showed 4:15. Because she was eager and impatient, she went straight over to the sideboard and took out her best tablecloth. When she had smoothed out the folds, she set it elegantly, cornerwise, so that the 4 little triangles of dark mahogany were left at the corners. Then she got out the best cups, the ones with a voluptuously opening rose painted passionately on the side, and the silver teapot. By the time she had put the cake rack on the table as well, it was evident that she was doing things in style. The table was laid significantly for 2. Finally, she went through to her bedroom and changed her lace cuffs. The new pair looked exactly the same as the old ones, but Mrs. Vizard was very particular about her cuffs. No lady, she remembered reading as a girl, will ever tolerate soiled lace. She had remembered it, in fact, right through from 1890 until 1938, until she was almost the only person left in London wearing lace cuffs. When she changed her cuffs, she studied herself carefully in the mirror. There was a wisp of hair out of place, and she shackled it with another hairpin. Apart from that, there was nothing that needed doing. The face that gazed back at her was as smooth and unwrinkled and expressionless as it had always been. The long, dark hair, plaited tightly in the nape of the neck, was so smooth that it might have been melted down and poured on. But it was still too early. 4:30, she had said, and it would be unthinkable to make it earlier, to appear impetuous. As it was, she was growing apprehensive again. The folly of what she was about to do became apparent to her, and she half regretted it, but only half. To occupy the time, to kill the intervening 20 minutes, she took out a cushion cover that she was embroidering. The design, like that on the teacups, was a rose so full-blown as to be almost wilting. With quick, deft stitches, she began filling in the red unfolded heart. Excuse me. A bit of a sudden dry throat there. But her mind was too full on other things this afternoon to concentrate. And finally she gave up in the attempt. Thrusting her needle right into the eye, she sat back, pondering. Maybe I'm being a little too foolish, she admitted. It may even be rash and indiscreet. But I have no one but myself to consider in the matter, and no one need ever know. It's only because he's lonely that I'm doing it. And he really is rather distinguished. I've never known one socially before. It will be very stimulating. I wonder if I shall find that I'm sensitive to anything. She looked at the clock. It was 4:30 now. No one need ever know, she repeated. It's only just this once, and it'll be quite private. All the same, she realised how close the moment was. Her heart was fluttering a little, and it was pounding and thumping, most remarkably as she got up and left the room. Outside Mr. Squale's door, she paused, hesitating. This is absurd, she rebuked herself. I'm getting into a state like a little girl. Controlling herself, she knocked. Mr. Squales, she said, trying to keep her voice steady and natural sounding. Would you be free to join me for a cup of tea? The reply was not so prompt as she had anticipated. She had expected that he would rise at once and open the door to her. Instead, there was a grunt and the scraping of a chair. 2 chairs. Almost as though he'd been asleep in the armchair with the broken springs, with his almost as he'd been. Sorry, let me read that again. Instead, there was a grunt and the scraping of a chair, of 2 chairs. Almost as though he had been asleep in the deep armchair with the broken springs, with his feet up on the hard Windsor one opposite. There was a further sound of scraping, as though he was searching about for his slippers, and then the door opened, and a squalid and tousled tousled Mr. Squales stood there. His black cravat was undone and hanging downwards, and his velvet jacket was secured by the wrong button, as though he'd pulled the thing on hastily together whilst he was still rather muzzy. On the mantelpiece behind him stood a beer bottle and a dirty glass. "Dear me," he said, "so late already. I'm afraid that I must have dozed off for a moment. You were asking to take tea with you? How delightful, how very delightful it would be." Mrs. Vizard re-inspected him and then averted her eyes. In 10 minutes?" she suggested. "In less? 5?" he answered. "Almost straight away. I'm practically ready." Mrs. Vizard returned to her room and stood there for a moment, motionless. "I was wrong," she confessed. "I lowered myself, and I've been punished for it. Mr. Squales is not a gentleman. Not a gentleman would have been in... No gentleman would have been in such disorder." But 5 minutes later, when he arrived, he certainly looked a gentleman. His hair, except for the lock that naturally hung downwards, was sleeked back across his head, and his cravat was now tied up with a flourish. He had buttoned up his jacket properly and put on a pair of shoes in place of his slippers. Also, his manners were perfect. He came in diffidently, apologetically, as though he knew that he was in disgrace. "I shall never forgive myself," he said. "Never. I have been working and I fell asleep. I can only say that I was very, very tired." Mrs. Vizard accepted his apologies. It was flattering, decidedly flattering, to have a professional medium, an international one even, paying so much personal attention. "I shall ask him," she thought, "what he feels it's like to be a medium. What are the sensations of being one, of the spiritually chosen?" But all that she said was, "Do you take milk and sugar, Mr. Squales?" And in a way, Mr. Squales' reply rather disappointed her. "Milk, please, and 2 lumps," he said. "I like it very sweet and rather milky." There seemed something oddly unspiritual in such an answer. It was almost as if Mr. Squales were a greedy man, and he certainly made an uncommonly good tea. He certainly made uncommonly good tea. He sat there wolfing scones, bread and butter, and 2 kinds of cake. Poor man, he's ravenous, Mrs. Vizard reflected. It's more than a pleasure, it's duty to feed him. And Mr. Squales seemed to repay feeding. Under the influence of food and several cups of his especially sweet milky tea, he lost the reserve that had hung over him that had been so chilling, but his manners remained perfect just the same. He asked Mrs. Vizard's permission before he smoked his first cigarette. Apparently he smoked a lot of cigarettes. His fingers were stained and discoloured right up to the nails. "Now," thought Mrs. Vizard, "I'll put my question to him." But Mr. Squales spoke first. "Have you lived long in this house, Mrs. Vizard?" he asked. Mrs. Vizard dropped her eyes. "I came here as a bride," she said. "So..." Mr. Squales deliberately prolonged the word. He made of it a sound that was so at once infinitely understanding, sympathetic, and consoling. "And now you are alone," he went on. I am a widow," Mrs. Vizard told him. "Sad. How sad," Mr. Squales replied. "In the midst of life, as the poet says. And is it long since Mr. Vizard died? Passed on, I should say." 1922, Mrs. Vizard answered. "Michaelmas, quarter day." She had a concise and businesslike mind, even in matters of the heart. She remembered the dates as she remembered figures. Since then you have been alone, Mr. Squales persisted, as though the loneliness of Mrs. Vizard held a special fascination for him. I've had my guests, Mrs. Vizard replied sharply. From the time I took matters into my own hands, I've never had a room empty. It was not true, as Mr. Squales knew, but Mrs. Vizard was quick to answer any aspersions. She had, however, misunderstood the observation. No, Mr. Squales said, brushing the point aside with the tobacco-y fingers in the air. Not in that sense. In the more important one. You have been alone in the world, I mean. I've had my faith, she told him. I only really learnt to know my late husband after he went across. Mr. Squales drew himself up sharply. Ah, yes, the other world. What a comfort it can be, he remarked. What an awakening. A dreamy look came into Mr. Squales' dark eyes, and Mrs. Vizard drew in her breath expectantly. Now was the moment. Without any prompting from her, Mr. Squales was going to talk about the life beyond. But in this she was disappointed. At least for the time being, it seemed he was entirely preoccupied by things on this side. I have a curious feeling, he began, that it was no accident that brought me here. I had other addresses, other houses to go to. I knew no one, yet I came here. I knew from the moment you answered the door to me there was no need to go further. There was something that told me I had arrived. I'm glad that you're comfortable, Mrs. Vizard faltered. Mr. Squales' eyes were cast full on her. I am more than comfortable. I am at home, he assured her. For some reason, Mrs. Vizard found herself blushing. It was an unfamiliar sensation, rather unpleasant, as though hot ants were running over her. She was aware that Mr. Squales was still looking at her hand and smiling. The ants began to run around in circles. Mr. Squales cleared his throat. It's very strange, he said. I see now how wrong I was. When I first saw you, I took you for a much older person. I took you for a woman already middle-aged. We come to the end of that point, ladies and gentlemen. Are you enjoying it? Is it going well? Spooky, says Dudley. I think he is responding to something I typed a while ago. Squales is the epitaph of obsquishiness. Is a word that I know, but I can't pronounce it. I'm feeling a little better after my guinea passed away. Oh, your guinea pig, presumably. Please, you're feeling better. GPs are little sweethearts, unless, of course, they have a medical practice. Percy was feeling pretty good. Quite okay, in fact. He got himself just where he liked to be, right in the ringside seats. And there was no doubt about being in the thick of things. Trainers and managers and pressmen kept pushing past him. And when one of the boxers managed to get the other up against the ropes, it was as though the fight was not merely going on the front, but actually on top of him. Only 2 seats away, another gentleman, a big man in a light grey suit with a carnation in his buttonhole, had burnt himself on his own cigar when a featherweight had come slithering out of the ring on his back into the midst of the spectators. It was life, all right, hot life, where Percy was sitting. Next to Percy was Mr. Josser. They hadn't just met there by chance either. Mr. Josser wasn't the sort of person who went about to prize fights. It had all been part of a carefully thought-out scheme, a plot, almost, of Percy's. He told himself the best way of getting to know Doris was to put himself on easy terms with her family. And it was because he didn't know how to tackle Mrs. Josser straight away. He couldn't, for instance, just ask her to put on a dance frock and come along to the Palais with him, that he'd begun on Mr. Josser. Even then he'd been cautious. The one thing he wanted to avoid was being obvious. So in the end, after paying 5 shillings for each of the seats, he told Mr. Josser that they'd been given to him. It gave him a pleasant sensation of well-being. He'd already got £25 in advance on account of the hot Bentley, to be able to lay out half a quid for the sake of the girl he loved. And Mr. Josser had quite innocently accepted. He'd never seen a boxing match before. He didn't indeed particularly want to see one, but it seemed so nice of the boy to have thought of him that he was afraid that he would be disappointed if he refused. Mrs. Josser remained frankly disapproving of prize fights, and Doris was cross with her father for going at all. It seemed to lower his dignity somehow. The only person other than Percy who was thoroughly delighted by the arrangement was Mrs. Boone. She gave a great sigh of relief when she heard that her son's companion was to be Mr. Josser. It was the first time she could ever remember since Percy had grown up when she had really known where he was and with whom. The fight was taking place at the Baths. About 400 people were watching it. It was, of course, only the ringside seats that were expensive. Elsewhere in the house, the prices of admission went right down to £1 for standing room, of course. But there were plenty of people in the middle income classes, people who were ready to pay 2 shillings or half a crown to sit in one of the galleries, craning their necks round the ornamental iron pillars to see the pugilists from that distance, looking no larger than frenzied pygmies hammering away at each other about 30 feet below. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, and blue spirals of it went drifting in little eddies across the brilliant block of light that was shed by the shaded lamps above the ring. Now the lesser weights, the trivial stuff, had frisked and feigned and glissarded and were over. Percy and Mr. Josser had watched a flyweight, a featherweight, a bantamweight and a cruiserweight. And they had come at last to the serious business, the real purpose of the evening. Tiger Stoneman of Stoke Newington, who turned the scales at 12 stone 7, was about to put himself to the supreme test of strength against Battling Charlie of Balham, who was a full 13 stone. It was going to be a battle of the giants, and most of the audience was outside priming itself on beer to be ready for the ordeal. There was indeed something pretty impressive about the way which, since 7:30, the spectacle had been devised in a mounting crescendo of calves and biceps. Starting off with agile, flimsy creatures like fierce dwarfs, it had now got itself among the Titans, and it looked like going on that way. There was the half-veiled hint behind the arrangements that if the display lasted for another half an hour, giant monsters about 10 feet high and weighing 20 stone would trample their way into the ring like dinosaurs. In the meantime, Tiger Stoneman was quite big enough to please Percy, and even the bantamweights had been enough to satisfy Mr. Josser. The Tiger entered the ring in his celebrated striped dressing gown, allowed his seconds, 2 bullet-head thugs like escaped convicts, to disrobe him as though they were too well-bred to do that kind of thing for themselves, and he stood there like a cockerel, turning himself about for people to admire him. This performance was interrupted at last by the arrival of Battling Charlie, an older man and clad in a very drab sort of wrap. He aroused no enthusiasm until he showed his chest. Then he got a round all to himself because he was so hairy. Mr. Josser was amazed. Battling Charlie did not look like a man at all. He was simply something from the trees that had come down to earth for half an hour to make mischief. And at the sound of the clapping, the great ape began grinning. He swayed backwards and forwards, enthusiastically shaking hands with himself above his head. "Now you'll see," Percy said delightedly. "This'll be murder." And it seemed to Mr. Josser that Percy was very nearly right. Quite early in the first round, Battling Charlie darted into his opponent's face with a straight right that everyone except the tiger seemed to be expecting, and his glove came away scarlet. After that, it was sheer jungle stuff. Every time he touched the tiger's body, even if it was only a jab, he left a small red print like a penny stamp. It seemed that bright, terrible wounds were being opened at random all over the beautiful white body of the boxer. By the time the gong went at the end of the second round, the tiger looked like a medieval martyr, and Mr. Josser was feeling sick. The rest of the evening was no more than a jumbled pageant of horrors for Mr. Josser. Assault and battery, attempted manslaughter, torture, disfiguration, death itself looked like, were all staged before his nose for him to laugh and wonder at. Great ham-like fists thrashed the air and divided it. Eyebrows were cut clean open, dust rose up in clouds from the flooring, and the sound of massive hunted breathing filled the air. Altogether, he might have been back in the red dawn of history. Out of all that brilliantly lit spectacle of commercial courage, there was prize money of £50 for one of them. Only two sights remained clear to Mr. Josser afterwards. One was of the smaller of the two thugs, who were the Tiger's handmaidens, clad in a pair of dirty grey flannels, white tennis shoes and a singlet. The creature was bending forward over Tiger, pouring drops of collodion or something into the open gash in his forehead. It was first aid at its most brutal and elementary, and apparently the tiger didn't like it. He kept shaking his head and growling. About the whole proceeding there was a suggestion of a piece of intricate brain surgery being performed at the hands of the butcher's boy. The other sight that remained with Mr. Josser was a self-contained nightmare. Battling Charlie had worked his man into the corner and was getting ready to eat him like an ogre when Tiger suddenly caught him full in the mouth with a half hook. The effect was appalling. Battling Charlie was rocked backwards on his heels, and when he recovered himself, what seemed to be his entire set of white front teeth fell out on the floor and were trampled on. Young Percy leant over affectionately and thrust his mouth against Mr. Josser's ear. "There goes his gum shield," he said gloatingly. "I told you there'd be murder." But Mr. Josser was past caring. He was sitting there with his eyes closed and his hands up in front of his face so that Percy shouldn't notice. Even with his eyes shut, however, he couldn't help himself being cut off entirely from what was going on behind the springy ropes, for shutting his eyes didn't keep out the sounds. There was the soft, sinister thump of the punches when they hit the body, and the sharp click when the jaw or the forehead caught it. There was also the whole host of other horrid little sounds as well. He now recognised every one of them. He knew the noise that wet towels make as the seconds flap them in their faces of their wilting pets, the glug, glug, glug of the water being drunk from the bottle. Apparently it would have been unseemly for a pugilist to be caught drinking from a tumbler, and the rough friction of hairy, muscular legs being massaged. And it would have been absurd, when the climax came, to pretend that he hadn't heard that. There was a bang that seemed to shake the whole baths, and somebody was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, quite slowly. Mr. Josser opened his eyes. Battling Charlie, the hairy one, the old man of the trees, was lying flat on his back with his knees drawn up almost to his chin, and Tiger Stoneman, the young, the 12 stone 7, the beautiful, was standing beside him wearing a slightly dazed and self-conscious expression, as though he wasn't altogether sure about the politeness of what he had just done to the older man. Young Percy, Mr. Josser noticed, was nearly hysterical with delight at the outcome, and when the referee finally counted Battling Charlie out, small desultory movements of the legs indicated that the hairy body was still alive, or at least the muscles were still twitching, and Percy's feelings became almost uncontrollable. Taking his soft green felt in one hand, he smashed it flat with the other. "Oh, boy," he said over and over again. "What a punch! You tell me, what a punch!" It was only a quarter of an hour's walk from the Baths back to Dulcimer Street, but Mr. Josser was grateful for every moment of it. He felt a need for the fresh air, and he went along drinking in the night, great gulps of it. In a sense, it was taking Percy even longer to recover. A small envelope of violence still surrounded him. As he walked along, he found shadowy battles with himself. He made sudden darting sidesteps, although to avoid imaginary adversaries, brought up short left jabs against chins that only he could see. He shook his head helplessly when some spectral, invisible blow, harder than the last, landed full on him. "Oh, boy," he repeated from time to time. "Was that a punch? Tell me, was that a punch?" And then a strange mood of shyness came over him as he remembered Doris. He was being led back to the house in which she lived, and by her father too, and he was practically one of the family. "Come in and have a bite of something," Mr. Josser suggested when they got back to number 10. "I could do with it." "OK," said Percy, and then paused. "Think it's all right, me coming in like this, without knocking?" he said. Mr. Josser regarded him in astonishment for the moment. "Why ever not?" he said. "It's Liberty Hall." Mrs. Josser seemed, however, a somewhat severe custodian of so much freedom. "Good gracious," she said, "you're back early. Did the police stop it or something?" Mr. Josser didn't reply. He hung his hat up on the hook outside and forced his companion into the room in front of him. "I've brought Percy back with me," he said. "We've just—" But he was cut short. It was Doris who had spoken. She was kneeling in front of the fire, and he hadn't noticed her until that moment. Apparently she'd been doing something to her hair. A brush and comb and a bottle of setting lotion was spread out on the rug beside her. Her jumper was off, and there was a towel wrapped around her shoulders. "You'd better go through to the bedroom, Doris," Mrs. Josser said, meaningly. "Oh, sorry if I'm disturbing anyone," Porris said, gallantly. "Oh, you're not disturbing me in the least," Doris answered. "I was just going, I assure you." She got up, very red in the face from hanging over the fire, and pushed her way past him. Percy was aware for a single moment of a delicious nearness and the odour of the setting lotion, and then it was all over. The door shut behind, and she was gone. Mr. Josser went over to the cupboard. "Cup of tea, Percy?" he asked. But Percy scarcely heard him. He was thinking ruefully of the whole wasted evening. It had all been all right. It had been all right while the boxing lasted, but after that, nothing. It simply chucked away 10 bob and giving Mr. Josser a private treat. So far as his stock stood with Mrs. Josser, it was lower than ever. "I've been made a sucker of," he thought miserably. "That's what's happened. I've been made a sucker of." And we come to the end of that chapter with Percy feeling low because Doris is not interested in him, with Tiger having won over the hairy ape in the boxing match, and Mr. Squales being invited for tea with Mrs. Vizard. Mrs. Vizard has an ulterior motive, but she never got to it. How exceedingly exciting. Another episode of London Belongs to Me. My God, I wish Norman Collins had written 20, 30 or 40 books in that style. It's so lovely. Anyway, my great-grandfather was sent to prison for prize fighting, says Billabong O'Neill. Blimey, was he? That sounds a bit rough. Lee Lawson says, I've got a fist fighter and trainer in the family. Early 1850s. He was quite well known. I've been researching him recently. The accounts of the fights are hideous. I bet they are. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you will join me tomorrow at the same time. I look forward to it. In the meantime, Jen says, I'm exhausted. This book has everything, says Dudley Sawyer. It certainly does. It has everything. It is, I can tell you, the first time I ever read that, I loved it so much. I love it now, but I know what's happening. But just the detail, as it slowly unfolds, it's just this wonderful, it's so cleverly, the plot is the plot, but it's the scenery, the set, the smells, the essence of 1938 London that just screams at you. I think it's brilliant. Anyway, there you go. Take care. Thanks for watching. Look after yourself, and I will see you tomorrow. There's a Vobe show, of course, tonight, but I will see you tomorrow. Bye for now.